Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing really well. My name's Rebecca Cummings, and I'm a librarian at Marriott Library. I am so excited to come and talk to you today about mis and disinformation. So this video is basically going to be in two main parts. The first part, we're going to talk about some of the concepts of mis and disinformation, really trying to support some of the readings and resources that you looked at this week. And then second, we're going to talk about some strategies for evaluating information. So you may not think that you're susceptible to believing untrue things, but in our current information environment, everyone can work on improving their information literacy skills and learning how to hone their skepticism a bit when they come across information that may or may not be true. All right, so let's go ahead and get going. So, before we dive into misinformation, I'm going to bring up a key point of information literacy. And if we don't agree on this, there's really nowhere that we can go from there. And that concept is that information has value. Some information is good and some information is bad. And by good information, I mean information that reflects some truth about the world. If I were to say to you, the University of Utah football team won the Sugar Bowl in 2009, that is a statement that's either true or false. And there are different ways of ascertaining its truthiness. Maybe you were at the game in 2009, lucky you, and you saw with your own eyes that the University of Utah won the Sugar Bowl. Maybe you read about it in the newspaper. Maybe you watched the game on TV. Maybe if you're not from Utah or just really not a football fan, you're just kind of taking my word for it right now. Librarians tend to be kind of credible. It'd be a really easy thing to verify online. So maybe you're just believing me when I say that the University of Utah won the Sugar Bowl in 2009. But the statement I made, the fact is it's either true or not true, which means that it does or does not comport with facts about the world. Now, there has never been a time in human history when there wasn't good information and bad information. And yet, in so many ways, including the invention and the widespread adoption of the internet, social media and its algorithms that favor inflammatory content, the decline of local journalism, the rise of cable news media, the commodification of your attention, our own cognitive biases, and our appetite for instantaneous answers. All of these things have brought us to a place where we are swimming in a sea of misinformation, making information literacy skills absolutely critical for navigating our current information environment. So, you had some readings this week and some things, including an assigned podcast that featured Claire Wardle, who is a misinformation expert who goes around the world training journalists how to identify and combat misinformation. Dr. Wardle says there are three things that you need to think about when you're evaluating a piece of information. The first is the type of information that's being shared. Now, Dr. Wardle talked about this a little bit in the podcast, but she has an ontology for misinformation that she calls the 7 kinds of misinformation. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that because I think it's really important to understand the complexity of the different kinds of information that are being shared. It's also important to think about the motivations behind people who create that content. Because you have to remember that information, the creation and the delivery of it, they're intentional processes initiated by human actors who have their own motivations and goals. And for us as information consumers, it's important to think about what those motivations might be. And then lastly, in order to evaluate information, you really should think about the way that the information is being disseminated. Now, traditionally, working in academic libraries, I talk to students a lot about the process of, scholarly communication and scholarly information dissemination. And that often is talking about channels like, peer review or citations, thinking about how scholarship is a conversation where different experts in the fields are citing one another, and based on like the citation counts, it might be something that's more important in the field. Misinformation is often shared in much more loose channels where there's very little oversight, and they're shared in different ways. Misinformation can be shared by careless retweeting or careless sharing of information that maybe it speaks to you in some way, but you're not thinking about the information before you share it or verifying its veracity. It could be shared by bots or troll farms. It could be shared by poor journalism of journalists who just aren't, they don't have a high ethical standard. Maybe they're just not taking the time to verify their sources or to make sure their facts are lining up. Now, one thing I love about the way that Claire Wardle thinks about misinformation is that she makes it much more complex than the overly simplified term fake news. You know, as she says, most of this information isn't fake and most of it isn't news. A lot of it is genuine information that's shared out of context or wrapped in some narrative that furthers the aims of the person sharing it. And so she has these 7 ways of thinking about misinformation that I think are really useful. And I've set it up here sort of similar to how she does, which is thinking about the least harmful kinds of misinformation to the most harmful kinds of misinformation. So she starts off by thinking about satire, which you might like already be thinking satire isn't misinformation. It serves an important role. It helps us think about, sometimes it provides important political or social commentary on things going on in the world. We all know that The Onion, you're not supposed to take it seriously. Well, the problem with satire and when it sort of veers into the misinformation sphere is when people take those things that are meant to be satirical and they make it into screenshots and memes and they share it in the world as if it's real information, and that's happening more and more. And so satire could be one form of misinformation. Another kind of misinformation is false connection or clickbait. And that's when headlines, visuals, and captions don't really support the content that it clicks to. And some of this also might seem pretty innocent or harmless. 19 kittens who can't wait to be cats. Like, that's adorable. It's definitely clickbait. You often click on it and you maybe don't get exactly the kind of information you hope for, or they just keep you clicking because every time you click, you're generating more revenue for their site. Slightly more nefarious are news articles, news headlines that promise these sensational things. And then when you click on it, it doesn't really fulfill the promise that the headline had. So again, this may not be something that seems like it causes a great deal of harm, but what it does do is make us lose faith in journalism. When we click on things, it doesn't really deliver the kind of content that we were looking for. The next kind of misinformation is a really common form, and it's one of the hardest to define. It's not that misleading content is untrue necessarily, but there's this layer of framing or narrative that people who are more familiar with the facts or who have more information about, like, the story, for example, might be able to point out the ways that it's purposefully misleading people who are looking at it. And this could be true of stories, infographics, images, that kind of thing. So in this picture right here, we're looking at an infographic that was shared frequently in the wake of the 2016 election, showing the different counties in the country that voted red and the different counties that voted blue. The implication when you look at this map is that it was a landslide, that almost the entire country was in support of the Republican candidate. And the underlying fallacy, of course, is that the red parts of the country are sparsely populated, and it's not land that elects our representatives, it's people. And there's more people are more densely populated in the blue parts of the infographic. So what this is meant to say is that the election was actually a lot closer than it was. And there's all kinds of misleading content where there's just partisan bias or this extra framing around it, taking what might not be untrue information but making it misleading in some way. The fourth kind of misinformation is what's called false context. And this is where we're getting into more insidious forms of misinformation. This is when genuine content is shared with false contextual information. And my example that I used on this slide was a recent one. It was from August when the CDC released a report of death certificate data around COVID. And, I didn't know much about death certificates, but I learned from seeing a lot of these misinformation stories shared, um, that when doctors fill out a death certificate, they fill out, the primary cause of death, but then all the other comorbidities or other potential causes of death. So on a COVID birth, death certificate, it might say COVID, it might say respiratory failure. If you have diabetes, they might list diabetes as well. But when this data was released, it was wrapped in this false narrative that because only 6% of death certificates only listed COVID, that the numbers were hugely inflated with COVID. And it was obviously meant to further a narrative or agenda for people who want to think COVID isn't as serious a problem as it is, or that it's a hoax. And this false context misinformation in this story is still circulating widely today. Now, the next kind of misinformation we're going to talk about is imposter content. And I also think this one is particularly insidious because one of the things we use to tell if something is good information or bad information is thinking about the people who are sharing it. There are obviously trusted news sources in the world, like the BBC. This one example on here for me on the right is misinformation that was spread with the BBC logo on it. So it was misinformation about the UK general election, saying that it was held over the course of 2 days. That was not true. But they added this BBC logo to give it kind of that proxy credibility. And this happens more frequently than, than of course, I would wish, where people take either public figures, like here's Dave Ramsey, we'll talk about that in a second, or they'll take legitimate news outlets and they use their imagery or they hack into their Twitter accounts to share information and make it seem as if it's from these legitimate places. The Dave Ramsey one is kind of a small one, but it was sort of funny. He is a conservative financial advisor, and there was a story going around on social media, like an essay that was accredited to Dave Ramsey. And when I saw it shared, I just thought that doesn't sound quite right. It seems a little outside of his lane of financial advice. And so I Googled it, and indeed, he had already posted on his social media, I didn't write this, don't believe everything that you read on the internet. A sixth kind of misinformation is digitally manipulated content. And we're going to see more and more of this content as these, as technology gets better and better and these tools get easier to use and more people adopt them. Digitally manipulated content, I'm sure you're familiar with, but it's when people use technology to make it look like people are doing something that they didn't actually do or say something they didn't actually say. This picture on the left here, it was debunked by PolitiFact, but it's an image of Emma Gonzalez, who was a survivor of the Parkland shooting, tearing up a shooting target. This was an image in Teen Vogue, but someone took that picture and made it look like she was ripping the Constitution in half. And so this was shared widely as if it was a real image. People believed it broadly. It was a pretty good fake. And so it looked like it was Emma ripping up the Constitution. And this is an example not only of digitally manipulated content, but of something that the original person who did the digital manipulation said it was actually satire. He wasn't trying to be harmful, but he was just trying to do a satirical image of Emma Gonzalez ripping up the Constitution, but then it got shared as if it were real. And then this picture on the right is just meant to be silly and to remind us that not all digitally manipulated content is bad. Some of it is just meant to be humorous, but it's something that we need to be aware of, that there's lots of tools, and so don't believe everything you see. The last kind of misinformation that I'll touch on here is fabricated content. And this is probably the content that's closest to what we would actually call fake news. It is 100% false. It is designed to deceive or do harm. One example of that is Pizzagate. You might remember the story from 2016, where it started on Reddit, where people were saying that this particular pizzeria, Comet Pizza in Washington, D.C., was actually a front for a child sex ring that was occurring in the basement. It was shared, it went viral on Twitter and different places. And someone actually went into Comet Pizzeria with a semi-automatic rifle and started shooting up Comet Pizzeria. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it's just a great example of how these fake stories can cause real harm in the real world. This example on the right is a kind of a lighter example, but really interesting one. Cameron Harris created this. He was a recent college grad, not even particularly political, but thought he could make some money by sharing fake news stories. So he created this website. It took him very little time. It cost him $5 to buy a site. He called it the Christian Times newspaper. He found this image on the internet, and he created this story about tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes found in an Ohio warehouse. So it was an election fraud story from 2016. And in the course of 1 month, this story was shared 6 million times on social media, and it made Cameron over $100,000. Now, after a little bit, it was picked up as a fake news story, and it was labeled as such. And then after that, Cameron actually, he had a bout of conscience, and he went to the New York Times and told his story, and just wanted to really highlight the fact that it's super easy to create this false content. And once it's picked up and goes viral, people just assume it's true. Even if it was later shown to be false, that doesn't matter, because by then people have read it and internalized it and believed it. Okay. So, speaking to the Cameron Harris story, there are different motivations for people, why people might share misinformation. And Claire Wardle has kind of cleverly summarized some of the reasons people might do that in words that all start with P. So, some things we've talked about already: poor journalism, parody. They might create this false information to provoke or to punk someone, passion, partisanship. Partisan and inflammatory news actually spreads much faster on social media than than boring, balanced news. And so there's a big profit reason as well for sharing this kind of biased and inflammatory content. Political influence or power, propaganda, these are all reasons why people might share misinformation. And it's unfortunate that we don't have the infrastructure in place that really prioritizes sharing good information that would benefit, the public good, not these other kinds of motivations. Okay. So, with all this in mind, considering this polluted, toxic information environment that we are living in, what is your role as a reader, as an information consumer? Well, as Mad Eye Moody would say, if you're a Harry Potter fan, constant vigilance. Every time you come into contact with something online, asking yourself these questions, is this story true or false? Is it biased in some way? Is it trying to make me feel a particular way? As a reader, use trusted news sources that rely on strict journalistic ethics. Verify your news sources. Use fact-checking sites like Snopes and PolitiFact and factcheck.org. Learn how to recognize these markers of misinformation. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into these concepts in the following slides. And one tool that we're going to use right now to talk about this is something that librarians refer to as the CRAAP Test, which is an aptly named test or marker for thinking about whether or not information has high value or low value, or if it meets your needs as a researcher. And CRAAP stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So we're going to talk about the C first, currency, the timeliness of the information. Thinking about when was this information published and posted online. All too often with misinformation, again, it might be a real story, but they're taking things that happened 2, 5, 10 years ago and acting as if it's something that happened yesterday, just to generate clicks or to, maybe for political purposes to make someone look bad, something that they did quite a while ago. Think about the timing of the image or the headline. Does it actually line up with current events? And this again happens because of poor journalism. People are in a rush to get a story out. Poor journalism, or maybe they want to use an unflattering image. So one example of this, during the pandemic, there were a lot of headlines about beaches being open during COVID, but they would actually take stock images of beaches in previous holiday weekends pre-COVID. Well, even though that might not seem to do a lot of damage, I mean, they're just showing a busy beach and the article is about, hopefully beaches aren't busy during COVID. It is creating this misinformation environment where the image is not actually perfectly lined up in time with the article. And then the last thing to think about here is, does your topic require current information, or will older sources work? So if you're doing research for a class, sometimes using historical sources is just fine. If you're doing some kind of historical research, or maybe you're using an article that's foundational in the field and has been cited 1,000 times, that's totally fine. But other times you really do need current information. Like if you are doing a paper on whether or not marijuana is illegal, if you looked at something from 10 years ago, you might be using information that's completely out of date for the topic that you're looking at. The second letter in CRAAP is R for relevance, the importance or suitability of the information for your needs. And this letter is less about trying to figure out if something is misinformation than determining whether the information is suitable for your needs as a college student. There is this whole world of information out there, but all too often we rely on like the first 3, Google hits that we get when we put in our topic into a Google search engine. But as a college student, you really want to think, is this a scholarly source? Is this the best information on my topic? Or is it a popular source? Not that there's anything wrong with popular sources, but you might want to search for something a little bit more scholarly, something that's been vetted, something that's for a college audience or a scholarly audience, and not maybe like a younger audience or a general audience. And there's a lot of markers for whether or not something is scholarly. Does it have an abstract? Does it have a bibliography? Does it have the credentials of the author right up front? And then lastly here, have you looked at a variety of sources before determining that this is the one you should use? When you're trying to find information that's most relevant for your topic, it's important to look at a wide variety and find something that really matches and is relevant and suitable for the research that you're conducting. Whew, this next one's an important one. The first A stands for authority, the source of the information. And I would put this up as one of the most important markers you can look for. Is the source of the article a reputable publisher? Almost anyone can be a publisher in the digital age, but some people have much more authority than others. If you're looking in a scholarly space, is it a scholarly journal that's maybe highly cited in the field? If you're looking in a more like newspaper or popular, from that kind of information, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, these might be sources that are considered more reputable. They have high ethical standards that they adhere to, of naming sources, of trying to gain multiple sources before you report out on a story. Seeking the truth and reporting it as a core value of their institutions. Second, what do you know about the author? Are they qualified to write on the topic? In a scholarly information space, people often put their credentials right up front. So if you're researching the pandemic, for example, you're going to want to look at the work of infectious disease experts, or you're going to want to hear from doctors who are actually working with COVID patients today. All too often when you find misinformation, there's either no author at all, or when you look up the author, they're not really qualified to speak on the topic that you're looking for, and they certainly shouldn't be cited in scholarly papers that you're writing. And then lastly, does the URL reveal anything about the source of the information? So when you look at the URL, you're often going to see .gov, or you will always see .gov, .edu, .com, .mil, .org, .net. Those URLs tell you something about the information. Not anyone can get a .gov URL or web address. That's only going to be for government information. .edu is assigned to educational institutions, and so they're different in kind than .coms, which are commercial enterprises. And .com doesn't mean something is bad. It just means that they are commercial entities, and they should have probably a heightened level of scrutiny. But there are very good sources like the New York Times, which is a .com. Okay, the next marker on our CRAAP test is accuracy, the reliability, truthfulness, and correctness of the content. So this is something that you can sometimes get at a glance. Oftentimes I click on misinformation, or what I later deem to be misinformation, and it just looks off somehow. I mean, the spelling might not be correct. There might be typographical errors, grammatical errors. It might just, the information might not flow. It might not seem unbiased. Oftentimes, like this first question asks, the information is not supported by evidence. They make assertions and then don't back it up with some kind of research. Has the information been reviewed, refereed, or fact-checked? Those are useful things that you can use when figuring out if information is true or false. In the scholarly communication realm, there will often be peer review or some kind of editorial review to make sure something is accurate. And of course, you can do your own fact-checking. If you find an article and it just seems like it's not good or not true in some way, go ahead and use one of the fact-checking sites that we've already talked about. Another question is, can you verify the information in another source? So if you have an article come your way or a website, and you're just not sure if the story that you're reading is true or the information is true, go ahead and use Google and figure out if anyone else is reporting on that story. If not, it's probably not true. And the last letter that we're going to talk about here in the CRAAP test is P for purpose. Why does this information exist in the world? Is it to inform, like this video here is today, or to teach? Is it to entertain? Is it to sell something? Is it to persuade? Again, thinking about the motivations of the person who created the content. Who paid for the research? Who funded the ads? Who approved the message? These things matter so much. There was once a time where cigarette companies were pumping out research about how either cigarettes weren't harmful, or saying that the evidence was inconclusive of whether or not they were harmful. Well, knowing that research was funded by tobacco companies, that's an important piece of information. And obviously, over time, we learned that cigarettes are very harmful. And there's still research like that today that's being funded by people that have their own interests in the research leaning one way or the other. A good example is that Monsanto does a lot of research around the safety of GMOs. And it's just fine that they're doing that research. And that their research might be good and true, but I would want another person conducting research that doesn't have a financial stake in whether or not GMOs are safe or unsafe. Other questions you can ask yourself. Does the point of view appear objective and impartial? And this is something you kind of have to look within yourself to say, like, are they trying to push a particular political agenda? Are they trying to make me feel a particular way? And this is true on every side of the political spectrum. I have my own beliefs, and sometimes, I think, oh, I'm a librarian and I'm not subject to misinformation, but I'll see an article that kind of stokes my own moral outrage. And then I think, am I being played in some way? So it's important not just to be a critical thinker, but to be a critical feeler when you're reading these articles, and think about your own reactions when you're reading these articles to consider maybe someone is trying to manipulate you in some way. And then the last thing we'll talk about here, does the author make their intentions and purposes clear? Often you can kind of know by seeing the author and what they say, like they're here to, you know, say this particular point. Sometimes they can, not be clear with their intentions, but sometimes they do make that information clear up front. Okay. So the last slide that we're going to have here is on honing your own skepticism. And these are just some reminders before we wrap things up. Learn how to recognize the markers of misinformation. Oftentimes, misinformation comes in all caps or with exclamation points. They use inflammatory language or allusions to research without actual links to research. But as misinformation gets more and more sophisticated and subtle, you're going to have to learn how to hone yourself or hone your skepticism even more for trying to identify that misinformation. Another trick I use is often looking at the About Us on unfamiliar websites. There are plenty of good websites or good think tanks or organizations doing good work, but I'm just not familiar with. So even if everything looks accurate and it looks good, I'll still go to the About Us to learn more about the people who are publishing this information to see what their credibility is. Google the site, publisher, or author. If you come into contact with information and you don't know what the website is, who the author is, who the publisher is, do a quick Google search and you can find out so much. I have several family members who love to share misinformation. And I oftentimes will Google the person, and not to be a jerk, but I'll like put the little Wikipedia link and say, oh, look, right here, it says that this person is a verified fake news source that has this financial stake in blah, blah, blah. So Google can be your friend in this information space. Again, using Google, Google a story and see if anyone else is reporting on it. If no one else has jumped on that story, it's very likely fake. Use fact-checking sites like Snopes, PolitiFact, or factcheck.org. And there's probably a dozen other wonderful fact-checking sites, but those are just three that I commonly use. And then lastly, if something seems too good or weird or reactionary, it likely is, even in 2021. So keep that skepticism up and don't believe everything you read. Before I go, I just really had to give a shout out for a safer information haven. Google is wonderful and serves a variety of purposes like we've talked about. But if you're doing research for your classes, a really wonderful place to start is the Marriott Library's website, lib.utah.edu. If you sign in with your unit and password, you have access to millions of scholarly and verified articles and information sources that will make your information so much more relevant and suitable for the kind of work you should be doing in your classes. And it's really a nice protection against misinformation. Nothing is ever 100% safe, but you're going to find a lot better information when you're working in the library catalog or in more scholarly spaces. So again, lib.utah.edu. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Again, my name is Rebecca Cummings. I'm a librarian at the Marriott Library, and you can always reach out to me at rebecca.cummings@utah.edu. Thanks so much for your attention. Stay safe.